coal is abundant. It's cheap. We know how to use it to produce electricity reliably. We have for more than 100 years. And almost everything about it, other than that, is kind of bad. Let's start with coal extraction. The prominent coal mining areas in the United States are Appalachia and the Mountain West in terms of the volume of coal that's produced. But there are other areas that you can see here that have existing coal resources that are of a high enough commercial value that they may be extracted in the future. And you can see that the different types of coal are sort of spatially distributed across the United States as well. So this gives you a sense for how much coal is produced in the major coal producing states in the U.S. These numbers are a little old. Looks like they come from 2014. Clearly, the highest coal producing state is Wyoming, followed by West Virginia, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Montana. So a mixture here of Mountain West and Appalachian states. So here's a time series of domestic U.S. Coal production, consumption, and net exports from 1950 to 2017. So what we see is that over this time period, the production of coal increased pretty steadily, as did domestic consumption of coal. And so at the very bottom, you can also see that exports were also exporting some coal on an annual basis. But what this should suggest to you is that almost all coal that's actually produced in the United States is consumed domestically in the U.S. And 90% of the coal that's produced in the United States or consumed in the United States ends up being used in a coal-fired power plant. So the coal industry, the coal mining and production industry, is, for all intents and purposes, sort of a branch of the electric power industry because we don't use coal really for anything else other than to produce electric power. So the exports that we do have in the United States mostly go to Europe, and then it's broken up by Asia and Africa and other parts of the world. But again, most coal that's produced in the United States is consumed domestically. So there are two main types of mining practices. Let's talk about underground or deep mining first. So this is what we would all sort of conventionally think of when we think of coal mining through history, which is a very dangerous process that subjects people and animals to conditions that are extremely adverse to human health. And there's also, I think, a strong historical and cultural element to underground coal mining that's sort of seeped into pop culture, music, literature. And so that this is sort of what we think about when we think about the coal industry as something that was extremely important for the economic development of certain rural areas, but also was a burden for the people that were actually involved in this industry. As I mentioned, coal mining historically has been an extremely dangerous industry. This top figure gives you a sense for the percentage of coal mining fatalities. So this would be deaths that are occurring while people are on the job. And so some of these percentages are getting up towards, 0.2, 0.3%. So, one out of every, 400, 500 coal miners is killed on the job, which is pretty ridiculous. And so you see this downward trajectory basically since the late 1970s. And so that looks better. And you might think that this is because the coal industry is sort of cleaning up its act and getting serious about worker safety. That's maybe somewhat the case, but there are other really important explanatory variables that have influenced this decline, and we'll talk about those in a second. The bottom figure shows the percent of evaluated mine workers with the most severe stage of black lung, which is a disease that's caused by chronic inhalation of coal dust by underground miners. So that's underground or deep coal mining. Surface mining is different. It doesn't involve people going under the ground. It first involves the removal of the top layers of dirt and rock that are above a coal seam, and then the direct extraction of coal from the seam using heavy machinery. So surface coal mining, because of the way that coal exists in geological features as a sedimentary rock, so it's deposited sort of laterally. Surface coal mining, by first removing the overburden, so the dirt and rock that exists above the coal, allows for a much greater proportion of the coal deposit to be recovered than underground methods. And one of the most famous, sort of infamous types of surface coal mining is called mountaintop removal. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. In general, surface mining, in particular mountaintop removal, is less expensive to execute, and importantly, and related to that, it requires fewer employees. And so this began in Appalachia in the 1970s as an extension of conventional strip mining techniques. Today, it's primarily used. Today, it's primarily used in Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee. So the advent of surface mining in the 1960s and 70s created a situation where it really didn't take long for the majority of coal production to be actually associated with surface mining. And so underground mining has stayed more or less steady, but was overtaken a long time ago by surface mining as a means of production. So what do you think happened to coal jobs as a result of this? So we talked about one of the main advantages of surface mining is that it's less expensive, and it's partly less expensive because it employs fewer people. So coal mining jobs decline. And so the decline in coal mining jobs is not why we see fewer fatalities, but certainly the increased reliance on surface mining means that there were fewer mining employees involved in riskier underground situations. Not to say that surface mining is without its risks. And so I wanted to show this figure in particular. So this shows coal mining jobs declining pretty steadily from 1985 onward, and sort of plateauing in the early 2000s, and then declining again under the Obama administration. I wanted to show this sort of blatantly political, or at least partisan, figure to provide some context, because there is this narrative, I think, that the Barack Obama's administration directly targeted the coal industry in a lot of its regulations, and that those regulations were responsible for the loss of jobs and economic activity in communities that are reliant on the coal industry. And so I think that figure that I just showed adds some historical context here, because what we saw, number one, is that jobs were being lost at a really significant rate well before George W. Bush took office, and that's related to the coal industry's increasing use of surface mining. Coal mine owners were preferring to use a new way of extracting and mining coal that relied on fewer people to save money. I think we can't discount the role of that. So we can zoom out here and take a look at what the sort of the big picture, 1950 to present day, in terms of coal jobs and coal production. And what we see on the left in terms of coal jobs is that even though there are some cycles, right, where we have sort of boom and bust periods where coal jobs are added and then lost, the downward trajectory is pretty steady over the last 60 years. And the latest sort of decline from 1980 to present is certainly related to the coal industry's use of surface mining as a way to save money, and that has employed fewer and fewer people. Now that period of decline was not associated with the decline in actual coal production. So what coal companies were doing was producing more and more coal with fewer and fewer people. And that's what we see over to the right. I mean, coal production increased from 1950 to about 2010 or 2008. And then we do see this decline finally in coal production that's occurred over the last 8 years or so. So I think you could paint a narrative that a lot of that was driven by policy, and there's a lot of truth there, and we'll talk about that more. But it's much more complicated than just policy. The market for U.S. coal is shrinking only partly due to regulations. The other part of this is weak electricity demand growth. Remember, 90% of all coal that's produced and consumed in the United States ends up in a coal-fired power plant, right? So coal production is really electricity production. And electricity demand is anemic in the United States. We are not really growing in terms of electricity demand anymore. We're hovering right at about 1% growth per year. So if the coal industry were growing at a greater rate, they would have to find somewhere else to sell their coal other than the U.S. electric power industry. The other thing that has been responsible for shrinking the coal industry in recent years is the natural gas industry. So coal-fired power plants have faced competition directly from natural gas power plants. And natural gas power plants have been, in many cases, outcompeting coal power plants. And gas prices are very low, and we'll talk all about why that is next time. The other factor, of course, that has resulted in this loss of production and loss of jobs in the coal industry is policy. So increased regulations on the operations of coal-fired power plants. And so from a combination of forces, both weak electricity demand growth, low natural gas prices that are outcompeting coal-fired power plants, and increased power plant regulations, the coal industry has really suffered. And several big companies have gone bankrupt. And so part of that bankruptcy is not just the fact that their revenues in the United States have declined, but also they anticipated a growing demand from China and ability to satisfy that demand via increased exports. And so they increased their reserves holdings. So in other words, coal companies spent a lot of money and accrued a lot of debt at precisely the wrong time. And right after they did that, the bottom sort of fell out of the market. And that's partly what's been responsible as well for some of these really big coal companies going bankrupt. Okay, so let's talk about the environmental impacts of mountaintop removal. We sort of digressed from that, but I want to stick with surface mining just for a few more minutes. So the general process that's associated with surface mining, which is again the dominant form of coal mining in the United States today, specifically mountaintop removal, is that the top of the mountain, the trees are clear cut, and then explosives are used to loosen the rock and topsoil. And then giant machinery is used to physically move the dirt and topsoil away. Now, the top of the mountain has to be disposed of somehow, and so often they just simply sort of dump that material into adjacent valleys, and then they're free to extract the coal. And then after this process, after they've extracted the coal, they are supposed to reclaim or refurbish the top of the mountain by sort of recreating the mountain's form or contour and replanting vegetation. The restored mountaintops are characterized by higher soil density, lower organic content, lower water infiltration rates, and low nutrient content. And this just means that it's really difficult to get native vegetation to grow. And so when there's high precipitation events, a lot of that rock and soil just runs right off into streams. You get iron precipitate, increased flooding. So a lot of the issues related to mountaintop removal were featured in this documentary called The Last Mountain. And so one of the main people featured in this film is a woman named Maria Gano, and I've actually met her before. So in undergrad, I was part of this environmental interest group at UNC Chapel Hill. And as a sort of glorified field trip one time, a group of us went up to mountaintop removal sites in West Virginia, and we met a group from Appalachian State. And the point was to visit some sites to understand what was going on and to speak to some of the people that were affected by this. So we met Maria Gano, and it was a very intense experience because she and a community of other people that were being directly affected by this, but also felt pretty disenfranchised and not heard by their political representatives or by the industry that was directly impacting them. So they were extremely emotional when they would talk to us about this. It was sometimes I describe it as like Scared Straight. If you've ever seen those videos where they take kids to prison and then they bring out the prisoners and the prisoners sort of get in their face and yell at them. It was kind of like that. She and the people that she was with were sort of speaking to us and yelling at us and being very emotional and not in an antagonistic way, but it was just I was extremely impressed, but also felt extremely sad and sorry for them and the situation that they were in. So anyway, I highly recommend watching that movie to get a better sense for this problem.